my name is Karen Fabian, and I'm the founder of Bare Bones Yoga, and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel. I'm going to be talking today about the idea of building sequences for yoga classes. So if you're a yoga teacher and you like to develop different sequences based on different anatomical themes, this will be an interesting video for you to watch. If you're someone who is practicing yoga and you're not teaching, but you want to create some practices for yourself that are focused on different anatomical actions, this will also be something that will be germane. So let me just kind of briefly start out with this idea that when building a yoga sequence for a particular anatomical theme, it's helpful to, of course, first identify what is the point of what you're trying to do. Sometimes we can connect it to something that is a common problem in kind of just posture in general. So let's take something like shoulder pain, or let's kind of broaden it even more, and let's say something more general like working posture. People that are hunching most of the day over a computer, sitting at their desks all day, this kind of desk-bound kind of corporate type worker, or really anybody. You could even be working from home, sitting at your desk all day. And this is a common profile for people. And so when you're thinking about creating a theme for your yoga class, of course, the more general and common you make the theme, the more broadly applicable it will be, versus picking something that's really super specific like lengthening muscles for bodybuilders. Unless you're going to do a special workshop, it's better to go with something that's pretty broad. And so this concept of, you know, my shoulders feel tight, I work at a desk all day, that's a really common theme that a lot of people can relate to. So let's first look at what you need to understand in order to create a class sequenced around that theme. So the first thing is you have to understand the anatomy involved. And so when we look at the shoulder joint and we look at this idea of internal rotation, we have to first know, what does that mean? So rotation occurs, oh dear, that does happen sometimes. Let's just put this to the side. Rotation occurs in the transverse plane, and it's the movement of turning in and turning out. So you see it in the shoulders, you see it in the hips. And so when we're talking about hunching over the desk or looking down at the phone, we're talking more about turning the shoulder in. So this action doesn't work as well on the skeleton, but you can certainly see on my body. So the muscles that are responsible for internal rotation primarily are the subscapularis, which is part of the rotator cuff, and it sits on the inside of the shoulder blade, and also the pectoralis major and minor, which sit here on the front of the chest. When we then look at muscles that are responsible for external rotation, we're talking also of muscles of the rotator cuff. The two muscles are the infraspinatus, which is in this region here attaching to the humerus, and the teres minor, which is also in this region here attaching to the humerus. So they're both on the back body, and they're responsible for opening the shoulder. So if I want to just kind of stick with that from an underlying anatomical standpoint, of course there are other muscles involved, but let's just kind of stick with that. Then I have to kind of work to, well, I have the movement, internal and external rotation. I have this overall theme of helping people who hunch a lot get a little more of the opposite. So now I have to move to, well, what about the poses? What are some poses I can do? So a really common shape you could integrate into a lot of poses is this common bind of interlacing the hands behind the back and drawing the shoulder blades together. You could also suggest to people who feel some tightness when they do it to put a strap or towel between their hands. And so you can take this action here, you can take this action in a warrior pose and make it a bound warrior. You can take this action in chair and bring a little more lower body strengthening focus as well as the upper body length. Certainly opening the front of the shoulders is going to start to lengthen those muscles that I talked about before that are really overly contracted. So subscapularis, pec minor and major. You can think of a super common pose, upward dog, as being a posture that opens the front of the body. You can think of some other poses like camel. You can do it in a bunch of different variations. That's going to open the front of the body. And so those are just some postures that would open, right? In addition, when we have muscles that work in pairs, so here we're talking about turning in the shoulders, lengthens muscles back here, and we're talking now specifically about the rhomboids that draw the shoulder blades towards the spine. Those muscles stretch out when I hunch. But when I do the bind that I showed you before, those muscles contract, the rhomboids contract, and the pecs stretch, pec major and pec minor. So this is an agonist-antagonist relationship. So when one muscle is doing the work, being the agonist, the other muscle is could potentially do the opposing thing. That's the antagonistic muscle. And so muscles oftentimes work in this paired arrangement. And so you can start to think about poses that take you one way and then take you the other way. A really good example of that in relationship to these two muscles that I just thought of is CatCow. So here I stretch the rhomboids, here I contract them. And you can do this multiple times. So those are just some ways to move from anatomical theme to anatomical action to posture, and then take the poses and pepper them throughout a sequence. And there you have the way or the recipe for designing a sequence themed in a particular way. Another common thing is to theme classes around hips. And hips like shoulders, same arrangement, ball and socket joint. And so we can start to think about, well, what anatomical actions might we want to focus on here? So we could focus on the same thing that we're doing here, internal and external rotation. But what if we did something a little different? What if we focused on flexion and extension? And we could theme it from kind of a similar perspective to the first one, where we said, well, let's look at people who are sitting a lot. And so the muscles, the hips here are in flexion, but it's more of a passive thing. I'm not actively flexing as I would be if I was running. I'm more just passively flexing. So now I want to focus on that, keeping in mind this general idea that those muscles are going to be a little bit weak from just kind of passively holding themselves in flexion as the person's sitting all day. They're also going to have the issues that we talked about here. And then I want to focus at the same time in strengthening some of the muscles that take the hip in the opposite direction. So here I'm talking about flexion and extension of the hip. So now we're moving in the sagittal plane versus the transverse plane where internal and external rotation occurs. And I'm talking about muscles like the psoas, which runs from the low back to the femur. That's your hip flexor, one of them. I'm also talking about the rectus femoris, which is part of your quadriceps 4 pack of muscles, and that starts on the pelvis and ends on the knee. That's also a big hip flexor. And then in regards to hip extension, I'm talking about the glute maximus, which sits on the back of the body, on the back of the hip, and pretty much covers the whole pelvis itself, and that's your hip extensor. So if I were to then go from, okay, people sitting all day, hip flexors that are a little bit weak, wanting to strengthen those and also bring some power to the back body, I've got that as my theme. I've got the focus muscularly in terms of hip extensors. Oh, also hip extensor hamstrings, right? So think of muscles in the back body here, glute max and hamstrings. And then in the front, psoas starts in the back, ends on the front because it comes around the front of the pelvis, and rectus femoris, pelvis to knee, part of the quadriceps 4 pack of muscles. So now I've got a whole bunch of poses that I can use. So I've got your kind of typical warrior 1, right, where here the hip is in flexion, here it's in extension. Of course, doing it on both sides. I've got warrior 2. I've got all variations of that. So the side angle, once I include the bind, I'm starting to involve some of the benefits that we talked about with respect to the shoulder. I can do things like dancer's pose. I can do some variations here in terms of the position of the hand. I can even switch it up and just do kind of a straight leg dancer's pose variation which might focus a little bit differently. Rather than taking the hip into a lot of extension, just keeping the hip more neutral and trying to stretch more the quadricep complex here. I can also change my relationship to gravity. So if I go down to the ground and I do something like bridge or wheel, I'm using a lot of hip extensor power to lift the hips. I can even do some variations of lunges closer to the floor. So something like this and then coming lower. I could even do some variations here. Whoops. Which will, let me actually do it on the other leg, which will bring this hip into extension. So as soon as I start to take this movement, I'm getting at not only length for the psoas, but length for the rectus femoris. So again, kind of just working with this theme of start with this general concept, identify the anatomical actions that you want to impact, that you want to involve in the sequence, work then to identifying the muscles that you're going to be honing in on, poses that involve those muscles in both directions. Here we're talking flexion and extension. And then from there, peppering those out into your sequence. So one thing I'm going to offer you is if you go to my website, barebonesyoga.com, right on the home page, there's a sequencing template you can download. And it brings to life a lot of what I'm talking about here, and we'll give you a one-page PDF that you can use to plug in this kind of information and create some sequences on your own. I'll also point your attention to my anatomy manual, which is a 200-page manual on the anatomy of yoga, and it starts with some of these initial concepts we talked about here, so anatomical actions, and then starts to drill down into muscles and poses, involving joints, and then there's a whole sequencing section at the end of the manual as well. So that's an idea. And then my book on yoga anatomy is Structure and Spirit. This just had its 1-year anniversary, and so this is specifically on the anatomy of yoga, as well as several chapters on some spiritual concepts. And then my first book, which came out in 2014, is called Stretched. And this is about how to build a yoga business and how to start to integrate teaching themes into your teaching once you've graduated from training. So all these tools are available to you on my website. You can also find the books on Amazon. The manual I sell on my own, and that's on my website directly. The sequencing template I mentioned is right on the home page. And I'll just close with 2 other notes. If you enjoy learning and talking with other teachers about anatomy, go to my Facebook group, the Bare Bones Yoga Anatomy Work Group, and join there. I've got over 200 members, and we talk about different anatomical concepts in the context of yoga. And then if you live in or near Boston, I live in Boston, and I just started this week a special offshoot of that anatomy work group, specifically for teachers in Boston. And I'm going to be planning some live events, workshops, and special classes, all themed in anatomy. And I want to get a group together of teachers right here in or around Boston who are interested in attending events like this, which I'll be planning in the near future and beyond. So thank you so much for watching. Again, the website is barebonesyoga.com, and I really appreciate you watching, and any feedback or questions, please feel free to send me an email. Thank you so much for watching, and namaste.